Hello again. This is the second lecture on the Canonical Parables. As I'm looking out my office window, I can see the chapel. It feels like I'm teaching toward the chapel. Of course, we all know that I should be listening to the chapel rather than trying to teach it. Anyway, I hope that you're all well, and let's continue our discussion. Where we left off is the question about whether the parables are allegories, and we talked about similes and metaphors and Aristotle's understanding of allegory. I want to give a quick example of one of the classic allegories of the ancient world. That's Plato's allegory of the cave. Many of you, probably most of you, except for possibly Xavier, have heard me refer to this. If you don't know the story, please get yourself onto Google. Pause right now, go onto Google and look this story up, because his understandings, the ideas that are portrayed in here, were very influential on the way you and I see the world. Anyway, in the story of the allegory of the cave, we do have this group of people who are in the cave, and we have and they're looking up and they're seeing images, shadows on the screen, and somebody, a wise man, comes in and leads one of them out to show him that he's not really looking at what is real, and he leads him out into the light, and he begins to show him what is really real, which is, according to Plato, not the physical world. And that's got huge implications for our understanding of the value of physical versus the value of spiritual. Anyway, in the story, it's very clear that Plato intended the story to be an allegory, in which the wise man would represent the philosopher king, and then the people, the population, the citizens of Athens, who are who are ignorant, don't quite understand what is really true. Another example I want to give you here is actually an allegorical interpretation of something. And there's a difference between saying something is allegory. If something's an allegory, then clearly it's meant to be interpreted allegorically. But sometimes you can take something that may or may not be an allegory and still interpret it allegorically. And one of the classic examples of this is Augustine's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. All right, and that is right here. I'm going to read just a few synopses of these. In this case, actually, it's from Norman Perrin, who describes it. In this parable, or in this allegorical interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Adam, the traveler who is traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, is actually Adam, according to Augustine, and he's on his way. In Jerusalem, actually, is where he's leaving. He's leaving that, he says, represents the heavenly city of peace, quote, from whose blessedness Adam fell, end quote. He's on his way to Jericho, and Jericho is the moon, according to Augustine, signifying our mortality. The thieves in the story are the devil and his angels, who strip the traveler of his immortality, who beat him by persuading him to sin, and leave him half dead in his sinful state. And the priest and the Levite, they represent the ministry of the Old Testament, according to Augustine, which could profit nothing for salvation, end quote. The Samaritan is the Lord himself, and the various instruments of his charity are aspects of the Christian faith. So in Augustine's treatment of the parable of the Good Samaritan, almost everything in the story is a symbol for something else. Now, if you were like me, the first time you hear this description from Augustine, you think, what on earth is going on here? Because this allegorical interpretation seems to be pressing the text way beyond its original meaning. And certainly that's a subject of some debate. Certainly one could question whether he's really treating, for example, the traveler analogically. What characteristics does the traveler have with Adam, really? So it seems like he's really pushing it. But that's a good example of a very extreme allegorical interpretation, in this case of a parable. Now, we do have some allegorical interpretations of Jesus' parables in the New Testament, and I've listed two of these. These may be the two only ones. I'm not sure about that. I think they are. But anyway, notice I still haven't answered the question, are parables allegories? But in order to get this, we need to talk about the different nuances connected with this. Now, in Mark 4, verses 13 through 20, what we have here is the allegorical interpretation of the parable of the sower. And one of you, it might be Xavier, I can't remember, is actually assigned the parable itself. You're not going to be interpreting analyzing the parable's interpretation, but rather what precedes it. Anyway, starting in verse 13, it says, "And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not understand this parable? Then how will you understand all the parables?'" Of course, that's typical Mark. "The sower sows the word." So now the seeds of the word. "These are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. And these are the ones sown on rocky ground. When they hear the word, they immediately receive it with joy. But they have no root and endure only for a while. And then when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately they fall away. And others are those sown among the thorns. These are the ones who hear the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth and the desire for other things come in and choke the word, and it yields nothing. And these are the ones sown on the good soil. They hear the word and accept it and bear fruit 30 and 60 and 100-fold. Now, that's the end of Mark there. Of course, the question is whether this represents Jesus' allegorical interpretation of the parable of the sower or the early church. And I think I'd come back to this later, but we're pretty doggone sure this represents some of the allegorical interpretation by the early church. And of course, they were saying that this is consistent with Jesus' interpretation itself. But notice here, it's not quite as extravagant. Certainly not as extravagant as Augustine's interpretation of the Good Samaritan, and yet it does take, the whole parable of the different seeds, and where the seeds of the Word of God, and then the different places where the seeds fall represent different stages of the encounter of faith. Now, the second example I want to go to here is in the 13th chapter of Matthew. Starting at the 36th verse. And he has just told them the parable of the weeds in the field. And let's see. Well, that starts actually back in verse 24. And this is very similar. This is actually Matthew's version. Very close to the parable of the sower. This is something Xavier or whoever's got the sower is going to need to wrestle with. But anyway, the disciples asked him to explain it. And he answered, this is now verse 37 of Matthew 13, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man." Whoa, now all of a sudden the sower represents something else. "The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. And the weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. And the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they'll throw them into the furnace of fire," and so on. It goes on through verse 43. Clearly, this is an apocalyptic allegorical interpretation of Jesus' parable, which gets to that question about how apocalyptic Jesus was, or whether apocalypticism represents more the theology of the early church than of Jesus. So these parables are tied to all kinds of issues like that. Okay, so there we have two new gospel and allegorical interpretations of in this case of a parable. Paul engages in chapter 4 of Galatians, one of my favorite chapters in the New Testament, simply because I wrote about it in my dissertation. But he's not interpreting here one of Jesus's parables allegorically, but he is interpreting the story of Sarah, Hagar, and Abraham allegorically. And this starts in verse 21 of chapter 4 in Galatians. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can do that, but I'll start it. Tell me, he says, you who desire to be subject to the law, will you not listen to the law? For it's written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. One, the child of the slave, was born according to the flesh. The other, the child of the free woman, that of course would have been Sarah, was born through the promise. Of course, the promise there is the covenant. Now, Paul comes right out and tells us that he's going to interpret this thing allegorically. The word in Greek here in verse 20, he says, now this is an allegory. It's allegoria. That's the word in Greek. These women are 2 covenants, he says. One woman, in fact, is Hagar. She is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the other woman, that's of course Sarah, corresponds to the Jerusalem above. She is free, and she is our mother, for it's written, and goes on, verse 28, now you, my friends, are children of the promise, like Isaac. But just as at that time the child who was born according to the flesh persecuted the child who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. And it goes on to talk a little bit more about this. Paul's explicit. He's interpreting the story of Sarah and Hagar allegorically. So certainly we've got plenty of examples in the New Testament itself of allegorical interpretation. In Mark and Matthew, allegorical interpretation of parables. But here in Galatians, allegorical interpretation of one of the basic stories in the Torah. I just want to say a word about some of the modern ways that allegorical interpretation shows up today. In many ways, it shows up in an awful lot of sermons, and I'm not using this pejoratively at all. But you just have to listen for it, to where a pastor or priest will say, well, this represents such and such. When they start using that kind of language, you know that they're interpreting the story allegorically. A couple classic, more distinctive types of modern allegorical interpretations would be Hal Lindsey's book, In the Late Great Planet Earth. He takes the apocalyptic language that talks in the book of Revelation, where it talks about Gog and Magog, and he actually sees them as representing the Soviet invasion of Israel. And he actually said that the number 666 in Revelation represents human attempts to imitate the Trinity. Okay, now that's some pretty far-fetched allegorical interpretation, but again, he is saying, indeed, that these things represent something other than what they are. Again, the question is what kind of characteristics they really do share in common. By the way, Hal Lindsey's book was very popular in the 1970s. And he used to hand those things out along with living Bibles. You get a copy of The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey. It is a really fascinating example of modern apocalyptic or modern allegorical interpretation of apocalyptic literature. And that, by the way, is not so far-fetched, as we'll talk about later. Now, in one of his sermons in the Meadowlands, in 1991, Billy Graham actually allegorically interprets the parable of the prodigal son. And he says that the younger brother in the parable of the prodigal son represents the runaways who are so common today, whether they're running away from home or actually even if they're adults running away from marriage. So he says that the prodigal son represents runaways, and that young man also represents the dissolute living of today's young people who partake in drunkenness and all kinds of sexual debauchery. And in fact, and then Graham blamed premarital sex as contributing to the spread of AIDS. You see the basic logic here. He moves from the story and he takes the main characters and the story and all of a sudden and some of the actions and says that they mean something else. All right. Now, the question here, were Jesus' stories intended to be interpreted allegorically? And we'll stop this lecture with that question and move on to the third one in just a second.